Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm going to just wait a few more seconds, let people filter in. Okay, so welcome everyone to this Montana Book Festival event featuring poets Forrest Gander and Theresa K Miller. This is The Consequence of Our Mutuality on Ecological Intimacy and Trauma. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm zooming in from my office in the Mountain Press Publishing Company building here in Missoula, Montana. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from a Bitterroot Salish word in Mizuletko, which means place of the freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of Glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Mizuletko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when Glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty. Following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish and other peoples in their efforts to acquire land. Yet, despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Totoyakan people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. For those of you zooming in from outside of Missoula, our authors included, I encourage you to take a look at the link in the chat so that you too know whose Aboriginal territories you're currently occupying. And go ahead, if you wish, to let us know where you're zooming in from this afternoon. I'm going to just kind of go through a few logistics before Forrest and Theresa take over and do their thing. I'd like to invite you as attendees to submit your questions via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Forrest and Theresa will address those questions during the latter part of their conversation in the last 10 or so minutes. But I do want to encourage you to use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves while the event is taking place. On the back end of things, Kate Morris, a MBF staff member, and I will be helping to monitor the Q&A and the chat for any logistical questions you may have throughout this conversation. And now for this main wonderful event, I'm so excited for the poets we're here to celebrate. Forrest Gander was born in the Mojave Desert and grew up, for the most part, in Virginia. Trenchant periods of his life were spent in San Francisco, Dolores Hidalgo, Mexico, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas. With degrees in both geology and English literature, Forrest is the author and translator of numerous books of poetry, fiction, and essays. He is the A.K. Seaver Professor Emeritus of Literary Arts and Comparative Literature at Brown University. Forrest has received grants and fellowships from United States artists and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Guggenheim, Howard, Witter-Binner, and Whiting Foundations. His collection, Core Samples from the World, was a National Book Critics Circle and Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his collection, Be With, won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and was longlisted for the National Book Award. Forrest's most recent collection, the one we're here to celebrate, Twice Alive, has been longlisted for the 2021 National Book Award. Welcome, Forrest. And a graduate of Barnard College and the Mills College MFA program, Theresa K. Miller is the author of Sped from Sidebrow Books and Forever No Low from Tarpaulin Sky, as well as co-editor of Food First, Selected Writings from 40 Years of Movement Building from Food First Books. Her poems and essays have appeared in Ziziva, Alternate, Entropy, Diagram, and elsewhere. Originally from Seattle, she now tends a mini orchard near Portland, Oregon. Borderline Fortune was a winner of the National Poetry Series. All right, welcome Forrest and Theresa. Go ahead and turn your videos back on, unmute your mics, and welcome to the Montana Book Festival.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Kate. And thanks for putting me together with wonderful Theresa.
Oh, thank you, Forrest. I'm really honored to be here in conversation with you.
Do we just kick in, Lauren?
Yeah, I think we
go ahead. Have at it.
Oh, all right. Well, as I wrote to you, Theresa, I'm super impressed with this new book of yours and with the condensation of syntax, with the music, the interior rhyme and off rhyme, echoey sequences, and the insistence about a lack of resolution, which I took to be a kind of aesthetics and ethics. I wanted to ask you about the relation of the conventional and the italicized texts, which alternate through the book, and also about the tense and variable relation between the I and you. Those seem to be the sort of the major sort of polarities in the book. Would you speak to those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for reading the book so attentively. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think the I and the you are very slippery in the book, as you noted. In part, I'm interested in fragmentation. Ostensibly the center of our talk today is around notions of trauma, ecologically, personally. And a hallmark of trauma is fragmentation, separating parts of ourselves from other parts of ourselves, essentially to survive. It's a very handy survival mechanism in the short term. It's pretty detrimental and imprisoning in the long term. So I was interested in that as far as intrapersonally pieces of the self speaking to each other. There's also the interpersonal aspect of kind of capturing the experience of trying to be rooted in reality and trying to be in relationship, or as this talk terms it, to be intimate, to be in some kind of connection with someone who is fragmented, or multiple people who are fragmented, how to be part of the pack and still a self rooted in reality, which is no easy feat. And then ecologically as well, I think that there is the physical trauma, right, that we as a species have inflicted on the planet. But there's also the trauma of not realizing anymore in a way that we're part of the ecosystem. It's an illusion that we're separate, right? No matter how much we try to have dominion over the earth, we don't. And that illusion is hugely detrimental to other species, to our own species. So I think in trying to be witness to the organism, starting with the individual and going more cosmically, if no one part has dominion over the whole, then there can't possibly be one fixed point to speak from. And so the poems are, shifting in that sense, animate and inanimate, personal and others, and ancestors, for sure. That's another big piece of it. So.
Yeah, those two forms of trauma, the personal and the trauma of what we've done to the world. I'm so interested in the way you bring those together in your poems. So very early in the book, the you, to whom so many of the poems are directed, begins to take on aspects of a landscape. And later, the speaker herself rises as a blank sandstone for someone to scratch a name onto, a stone carved to let water run down. In fact, all through the book, the non-human and the human seem to be merging. You'll write about your recollection from which a hawthorn grew, that kind of amazing thing. Or you'll claim, I cleaned up my brown leaves. I wondered if you would care to read the poem on page 5 that begins, I woke a forest, and maybe comment on the merging of human and non-human realms.
Sure, absolutely. I woke a forest. What sounds serene has a rotten floor. I could dress it up, candles on the sundered trunks, silk scarves and cut flowers. But you arrive already cleaving, a riven nausea in the cambium, some needle-leafed private anguish. The canopy swoons. You could hypnotize yourself a savior, nourish a legacy in your suckers and saplings, bank on a lightning-struck triple crown. Topple early and end it. So when I think about the question around merging, it actually ties into something that stood out to me in reading your book, which was this idea of, you said you must hear it feelingly. I hope I'm not misquoting that. And you also have a point where everyone's gathering and unto ourselves and sort of enjoying these bourgeois pleasures and wine and cheese, and the sun is beginning to set, and there's all this communication happening around the people in the poem from the earth. And one of the moments I loved, especially as a former massage therapist, is only being able to hear the decibels of the planet through the tali in the feet, which also evokes, the talus slope of the rock. So there's this point where the rock and the bones merge, and that's the point of communication. And it's something that can't be heard with the ears. It has to be heard in a tactile way or a spiritual way, or in, another language that we've maybe forgotten that we must know in some sense because we're part of the ecosystem. So to me, that was kind of a point of resonance between the books, and maybe speaks to your question. I think there's a way in which you almost know the answer from the exploration through your own book, that there are these moments where we have that point of intimacy with the ecosystem that we've always had, but it takes on a new level of consciousness, right? And instead of the self-consciousness that appears a lot in your book as well, that's so toxic around just the ways in which we separate by becoming so fixated on ourselves. It's more of a point of resonance and connection with the planet. So
Yeah, I think our books shared that. That's your nausea in the cambium, that human thing in the non-human thing. And it's true, both of us are drawing from lots of, well, as all poetry does, drawing from around us, but all of the information that comes into us comes into our bodies. It's our body that metabolizes the input from the world. And so it's our body, which is also made of the bodies of other creatures and the DNA of other creatures as part of our DNA, is in a mutualism with the environment that the body exists in.
absolutely. And I'm curious, when you were working on the book, right, because the lens is the lichen, and it's the fungi and the cyanobacteria or the algae that are, working together, and they merge and they become this new organism, and it's theoretically immortal. And it has, in your author's note, there's this very aspirational idea that, that could be in our most intimate relations, that we come to realize that our identity, all identity, is combinatory. And so there's this amazing collaboration. And I also feel in the book a tension of all the ways where we aren't lichen, where we are far less permanent and much more mortal. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that shadow life, because in a lot of ways it's a very vibrant book and very celebratory, in a sense of regreening and reawakening. And there's also the sense of how we aren't even theoretically immortal.
Yeah, I lost my mother during the pandemic, and
I'm so sorry.
She had Alzheimer's. She broke her hip. She had to go to the hospital. We couldn't visit her, my sister and I, in the hospital. We had to stand outside and look in through a window at her, where she couldn't quite see us and didn't know what was going on anyway. And it's a really horrible experience. But yeah, so I wanted to write a book that was, because there is so much gloom around us, and so much gloom around the ecological crisis that we're in. I wanted to put a different trajectory on thinking about ecology and try to find some positive things that come out of it. And in that way, again, I felt connected with your book. You're right, of course, that those species some species may have a theoretical immortality. We don't. But in some ways, there's something like that going on. And in the first section of your book, which is titled Of the Dead, the first poem begins, "I came here to conjure you." And it ends in two instances of the word orphan. And I was reminded of that amazing tiny poem by W.S. Merwin titled Elegy, which is just, who would I show it to? And Merwin implying that an elegy is always written for someone who can't read it. But you seem to be suggesting that an elegy is something that can conjure presence again, and that the poem resurrects the dead in some sense. Is that what you think?
Well, speaking to that idea of fragmentation, I guess it depends which part of me steps forward to answer, right? If that's what I think, because I think I'm of multiple minds on that subject. You had asked, and I never got around to answering about the relationship between the italicized pieces and the others. And one possible answer for that question, there are probably many, is I was raised by a religious, but also very phobic and also very superstitious grandmother. I mean, my parents raised me, but my grandmother was also a central caregiver for me. And she was one who would, put curses on people and really believed, if you kill a spider, it's going to rain, and read tea leaves, but also thought like she would never see me again because I wasn't baptized. And so we have all these
Wow.
Speaking of fragmentation, all these different kind of contradictory pieces of her coming together, even though at heart, I think that, she loved me and loved my family. And so there's part of me that could step forward and say, no, the dead are dead and they're gone. And like I said, I wasn't baptized. I'm not a religious person. I'm not an atheist, but I don't have any particular system that tells me we'll be reunited as much as I would like that. And then there's another part of me that, not just metaphorically, I think does believe in ghosts and has been visited by ghosts. And so when I was writing those pieces, one of the things that I was thinking about was that kind of fortune telling aspect of my grandmother's presence in my childhood. And another aspect, as far as bringing the dead back, I talk in the acknowledgments about my father, who was a relentless genealogist. By the time he died, he was killed when I was 23, and he had 30,000 of my ancestors and distant relations in a database, and he'd become kind of this hub for amateur genealogy researchers. And his impetus for doing that was that his mother had died when I was 4 of pancreatic cancer. And so here's this mathematician who loved his mother deeply and lost her too soon. And I think he was conjuring, right? He's bringing all the names of her parents and her parents' parents and their parents' parents. And he would have, the rational part of him would have said, well, no, she's gone. And I think the subconscious part of him would have said, I'm bringing her back.
Uh-huh. Wow. That's, it begins early on in the book. We're sensing this figure that's gone, that's left you. And it remains sort of ambiguous until close to I guess it's the third section, when you write, you had a father and we'll never have him again. And it's really interesting what you tell me about, and what you tell the audience about your sort of conjuring grandmother and her spells, because a lot of your work, a lot of the poems have this quality of spells. They're very mysterious. They're not working logically, they're working heuristically. They're mysteries charged with very vivid sensual details. I wondered if you'd maybe read that short poem on page 8, beginning, If I Had a Child.
Yes, absolutely. If I had a child, she was already mine. We did it backward, skipping time. The mouth of the Duwamish smells like creosote. Gravel yard. Freight train on a rusted trestle. We lashed a raft together and set off paddling. I wasn't yet born. The water, dried salty, reliable, cold.
Like, I don't know how to write a poem like that. Do you are you working from notes? Does that sort of just cohere when you come and sit at the table? That you know, those puzzle pieces that stay, separate, that form of fragmentation, but also a kind of hieratic fragmentation, maybe. What is your process for?
Yeah, and then I'd love to hear about yours as well, because that's one of my questions around the kind of your pushback against electronics. So I guess one of the luxuries / entry points for imposter syndrome, right, of not being in academia is that I don't have a good theoretical answer for that, because I don't think that there is one. And one of the stories that I have brought up periodically is when I was a baby poet just out of my MFA program, going to AWP and seeing Alice Notley on a panel. And somebody kind of leaned in and whispered to me, she engages in self-hypnosis. And I thought, oh, cool, like that's allowed. You don't necessarily have to sit down with a plan. And so I think my process tends to be, how can I not reject the world as it exists, but open some door in the world as it exists and go into the subconscious and dredge up a bunch of stuff and then bring it out into the light and see what's there. And so something that I love about talking to other people about what they get out of my work, and also one of the reasons why I tend to hedge and say, well, one answer could be, is because I think everything's in there intentionally, but a lot of it is intentional from the subconscious. And
Yeah.
you brought up around like music and the musicality and the echoes and that kind of thing. And I think if I sat down and tried to put that in really intentionally, it would probably be pretty stilted. But it's sort of like if you're learning a piece of music and you read it and you read it and you read it, and then finally it's just in your fingers and you just trust your fingers. And so I try to just sort of trust my subconscious and see what it wants to tell me.
Which I'm so grateful for, and as you said, is something I'm also interested in, because it seems to me that it's only very recently, the last couple hundred years, that human beings, especially in Western civilization, what's called Western civilization, which was also a term invented in fairly recently, that we've become so dependent on rational language, almost to the exclusion of all the other forms of language use that have characterized human experience from the beginning, where almost every culture that's ever been studied has some form of poetry. I mean, it has some form of poetry, some kind of laws against incest, and some formal way of dealing with the dead. And the poetry usually is connected with healing, shamanism, vision, and a human experience that isn't ratiocination. And I think poetry can bring us back to that intuitive thinking and feeling, where those things come together, like in the Japanese word kokoro, which is both heart and mind. So I love that. There's in there's I said vivid details, vivid sensual details earlier, but also there's this tremendous violence and undoing in your work. You mentioned the poem you just read. There's this, negation, wasn't born. And there's lots of negations, that even the sister who isn't a sister, the brother who isn't a brother, the unprotector and unwhisper, the unqueened, disintegrating ally, a section called disenthrall, an unknowable point, a not love. I mean, lots of that undoing combined with a lot of very violent language. The dissolving skull, this smashing to a bony pulp, and then this very inhospitable landscape of ice and glacier and frozen Bering Strait. Do you want to comment on that? Because often violence is connected in not only our culture, but many cultures with maleness. And there's also a very interesting and focused feminism in some of the poems. I wondered if that was connected.
Yeah, I hadn't specifically thought about that. I mean, as far as the loss and the undoing, you mentioned it's more explicit about my father, losing my father in the third section. But he was kind of the last of a whole string of people I lost, and certainly a touchstone for me. Definitely no shred of some of the more problematic emotional flavor in the early part of the book. It's definitely not about him. And I always feel the desire to bring Leslie Scalapino, the late Leslie Scalapino, into the space, because she told me at one point, meaning this as a very positive remark, I encourage you not to tell people that your book is about anything. And I have always carried that with me, because there's a way in which, like I said, if you dredge up this artifact, then it takes on a life of its own. And so I wouldn't want people to, read the book as memoir, because it's not. It's certainly not narrative. And yet, yeah, I think that flavor of undoing speaks to a lot of the death and destruction in a way that I lived through starting as a little kid, right before my grandmother died, who I mentioned, and died. She was staying with us as she was dying too young of cancer. Another family member got out of prison after being wrongfully incarcerated in Alaska for almost 7 years. My grandfather had a fatal stroke at my high school graduation, which then launched me into moving to New York. And so there's this way in which my experience has been very colored by loss and sudden unpredictable loss, my father being, the biggest piece of it. And then there's also, I think, in part being involved in horticulture, in being an orchardist and practicing permaculture, there is a way of seeing that in the context of the ecosystem, and seeing wrought in the context of the ecosystem as actually a really important force. So that's certainly one of the strands. I would personally, selfishly love to hear you read the night surfing in Bellina's poem, because I feel like it grapples with some of that staring into the abyss on this edge of the dark and the light coming together, and the vastness of the sea, and yet not quite being swallowed by an individual. To me, it really resonated, and I'd love to hear it in your voice if you're willing.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to read it. That fact that you keep an orchard also really tickled me, because I did also when I lived in Providence. C.D. Wright and I lived on a piece of land, a old 1847 schoolhouse that had an orchard, and I learned to take care of the orchard and really loved that work. And now the house that I've moved into also has an orchard um, full of 3 kinds of figs and pomegranates and Asian pears and regular pears and grapes and olives. I don't know how I'm going to get any writing done, but I'm really enjoying the landscape.
Oh, that's amazing. Unfortunately, if you don't eat it, all the animals will eat it. So
They're eating
it's
it,
not
yeah.
waste.
Right. So this poem that I'll read also ties us together because it's dedicated to Stephen Radcliffe, who was a teacher of yours and who lives in Bolinas and is a friend of mine and a poet I really admire, and a surfer.
Yes.
Sea, night surfing in Bolinas. Maybe enough light to score a wave, reflecting moonlight, sand, reflecting moonlight, and you spotting from shore, what you see only as silhouette against detonating bands of blue-white effervescence, when the crown of the falling swell explodes upward as the underwave blows through it, a flash of visibility quickly snuffed by night, the surf fizzling and churning, remitting itself to darkness with a violent stertor in competition with no other sounds. Paddling through dicey backwash, the break zone of waist-high northwest swell, as into a wall of obsidian, indistinguishable from night sky, diving under, paddling fast, and before I sit one arm over my board, I duck and listen for a moment underwater to the alien soundscape, not daytime's clicks and whines of ship engines and sonar, but a low spectrum hum, the acoustic signature of fish, squid, crustaceans rising en masse to feed at the surface. I feel an eerie peacefulness veined with fear. After 20 minutes, the eyes adjust. Behind the hand dragging through water, bioluminescent trails, not enough light to spot boils or flaws in nearing. Waves appear even larger, closing in fast, then 5 short strokes into a dimensionless peeler, 2 S-shaped turns, the kick out, and from shore, your shout. It is cowardice that turns my eyes from the now empty beach. For with you, I became aware of an exceptional chance. I don't believe in objective description, only this mess, experience, the perceived world, sometimes shared, in which life doesn't endure, only the void endures. But your vitality stirred it, leaving trails of excitation. I've risen from the bottom of myself to find I exist in you, exist in me, and against odds, I've known even rapture, rare event, which calls for but one witness.
Thank you so much. It's gives me chills. That was the first poem that really jumped out at me in the book. So it's just, I'm so glad to be able to go back and watch you read that again in the future. It's but I think it kind of ties into what you were saying around there's a lot of violence in there, there's a lot of darkness, and then there's also something very vital emerging from that. So I'd love to hear kind of your take on your question to me around, you know, what that violence means.
Well, you know, losing my wife 6 years ago it is, you know, will never stop haunting me. And absence, that kind of sudden absence that you also write about, the deaths that you've survived yourself, become wounds that you carry forever. and those presences are with you for always. So, and I think that sometimes, like that, like the baby bird in the egg has to break that world to break out into another world. It's a violent act of breaking one realm of perception to find another realm, and I think that's what we're constantly doing as human beings if we're attentive, if we're trying to expand expand ourselves in a full way, our souls, that we break through worlds, and that sometimes that involves violence.
Yeah, absolutely. In that poem, I love your line, "this mess experience." And I thought, that really speaks to what you were picking up on in my work as well, around an ethics around a lack of resolution, that's actually maybe something to strive for, to be able to sit, and if we're lucky to, I mean, the surfing, the vivid image is just in and of itself, a great capturing of experience, but that more metaphorically, that idea of catching that wave, of being right on the edge, of awareness, and then the alien world underneath, and then the fear mixed with this very intense aliveness, and it's very powerful. So.
I remember Creeley talking about reading. He said that he'd read that some scientific paper about artists having a greater capacity than most others for the mess, for not trying to resolve, that word that comes up in your book several times, to resolve the mess, but to be able to juggle it and to be energized by it, excited by it.
Yeah, I think for me, that's definitely been a journey. Sometimes I'm more energized by it than others. I think, on that strand of trauma, I don't know what your experience has been in the face of loss, but mine, there was sort of this dual consciousness that opened up. One was, I have no control. The thing that matters most can be taken from me in an instant. So nothing really matters, in kind of a liberating way. And then the other piece of the mind is, safety and control and organization at all costs. And so when you talk about process and, what's intentional on the page and what's not, I mean, I think that's one reason why I really feel the need to kind of push myself over into what's happening under the surface of the water if I want to bring back something meaningful that does expand, the witnessing and the commentary on possibility, because I think no matter how much, speaking for myself, I work on awareness, there's always going to be this strand of wanting to hold on really tight, and that rigidity doesn't make for good living, and it certainly doesn't make for good art, even though it would be so nice to have that comfort in the face of the abyss.
Yeah. I think there's a ceramic artist in Texas. What's her name? I'll think of it in a second. But in her kitchen, she has a big sign that says "Comfort Kills."
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it does. We fall into the comfort zones of our perceptions and our feelings, and I think it's up to art to help dislodge us from those ruts of perception and feeling, to give us more nuance, to give us more language, among other things, for processing experience. There's a line in one of your late poems in which you wonder how your sudden exit would shackle us to rebirth. We've been talking about rebirth. Oh, and it's so interesting. I was also thinking when you were just talking about my poem where I'm going underwater, it suddenly connected to all the points in your poems that are going under earth. There's so much dirt and soil and underland that seem to be part of a trajectory of feeling in your work. But I wanted to ask you, so there's a line in one of the late poems where you wonder how your sudden exit would shackle us to rebirth. And that line somehow seemed really key to me because in it, there's sudden loss, your sudden exit, there's imprisonment, this sort of violence and holding up and incarceration, but also the beginning of something new, the rebirth. And I wondered if you'd care to read that poem on page 63. It begins with a great grandfather and maybe comment on it.
Great-grandfather I never knew, your son-in-law born on Skokomish land I still cross, city to the razored oyster beds. Everywhere we've gone to plant our history, the lichen follows. Crab pot hauling up a giant octopus, Quonset hut surfing the permafrost, where my father's little hands could not will a single watermelon to grow. No chance you'd guess how it would subside, how your sudden exit would shackle us to rebirth. I think rebirth is kind of a double-edged sword, right? It depends on where you're coming from. If it's a blessing, if it's a regreening, or if you're doomed
Yes.
to go back and live another life until you learn the lesson and wake up.
Yeah.
And that's something I noticed in your book as well, talking about dreaming ourselves awake, and I talk about choking ourselves awake.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, some of the context to talk around that poem, my great-grandfather, Roy Thompson, so my father's maternal grandfather, who he was particularly interested in because, like I said, he was kind of trying to bring his mother back from the dead, was a teacher on Ingeluk, which is Little Diomede Island in the Bering Strait, in the early 1900s. And he was a wobbly and wanted to go and be of service to mankind and also needed a job. And I think it's one of those, one of many points in history, right, where an individual can have ostensibly good intentions and then be part of a larger, very destructive system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, the government and missionary school systems were not a healthy or humane force across the lower 48, and also not in Alaska. And I don't think that he had awareness of that at the time. And it sounds like he had good relationships with the people on the island individually, and still he was also a cog in this system that was quite destructive. And I think the other piece around that is, as now, you know, the tundra is melting, as the permafrost is melting, looking at that particular place and that particular history and that particular family member in relation to ice. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, where the land is actually still incrementally rising after the last ice age. And at the time that Roy was on the island, it would fully freeze over in winter, and people could actually walk from the island to Wales, Alaska, to pick up the mail, to go hunting. And now you see videos, you know, it's about 100 years, a little more than 100 years later, where in February you could just have these horrible waves crashing up, and it's completely upending this way of life. So.
We're getting close to time. Maybe we should each read one more poem.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you read another. I mean, I have all favorites. I guess my impulse would be, what do you feel like speaks to the book?
Well, you just mentioned a line about the dreaming itself awake, and that poem connects very much with our subject matter, sort of trauma. And I wrote it after, because of the wildfires here, which have been so incredibly destructive because the forests haven't been taken care of at all. I've been going out with a biologist poet named Maya Khosla, who studies post-fire forests. Because here in California, the process has been when a wildfire comes through, the the Forest Service, which is supposed to be taking care of the forest, often sells or gives that land to the timber industry to come and clear cut, which is even more destructive than the forest fire. It burns hotter, it burns away the mycelium under the dirt, and forests naturally recover very quickly. And one of the first, so Maya Khosla looks for species that are beginning to re-inhabit burnt forests. One of the first of which in California is the black-backed woodpecker. And then I'm also coming out of my own trauma with the loss of my wife, and I met someone who I live with now, Ashwini Bhatt, who's full of joy, and I didn't know how to process that. So this is post-fire forest. Shadows of shadows without canopy, phalanxes of carbonized trunks and snags, their inner momentum shorted out. They surround us in early morning like plutonic pillars, like mute clairvoyants leading a sursum corda, like the excrescence of some long slaughter. All that moves is mist lifting, too indistinct to be called ghostly, from scorched filamental layers of rain-moistened earth. What remains of the forest takes place in the exclamatory mode, cindered utterances in a tongue from which everything trivial has been volatilized, everything trivial to fire. In a notch between near hills stubbled with black paroxysm, we spot a familiar sun, liquid glass globed at the blowpipe's tip. If this landscape is dreaming, it must dream itself awake. You have, everyone notes, a rare talent for happiness. I wonder how to value that walking through wreckage. On the second day, a black-backed woodpecker answers your call, but we search until twilight without finding it.
It's beautiful. Yeah, that idea of walking through the wreckage and having it not be all wreckage seems to be a major impulse of the book. And I feel moved to share, even though this isn't on the topic of our talk, that because you've brought up C.D. Wright a couple of times, that I honestly attribute being here, in this phase of my career in many ways to a reading of the Barnard Women Poets series in the aughts, C.D. Wright and Lucy Brock-Broido, who
you
sadly
mentioned.
both gone.
Yeah.
That reading still to this day, I mean, I only remember little moments of it, but I remember the light and I remember the energy and feeling just so drawn in. And so I just wanted to put that appreciation into the space. So
Thank you. Read a poem?
Sure.
And just before you do that, that thing about you were saying about was it Alice Notley and the sort of trance that other poets interested in that, they're all women that I know. Kristen Prevelet and Brenda Hillman also working with trance and
Interesting. I don't think I knew that about Brenda Hillman. I am definitely,
oh yeah,
have been engaged with her work, but I didn't know that. That's really cool to know. I think on the idea of not resolving, I will read the last poem of the second section. And none of the poems are titled, just so people know. In the end, there was no end. You limp along, coated in ash, glowing like radiation or starlight. I won't know which until you go. Besides, they are the same. So long I chased the resolution, how to make concrete feel remorse. Swifts change course, bulbs will themselves not to bloom. You'll leave one more unfinished row.
And there's that agency again that you give to the non-human, which happens all through the book. The bulbs that will themselves. They have. I love that in your work. One of the questions I was going to ask is how that is how that is different from sort of old forms of personification. It's I see it as quite distinct. And maybe we should open it up to other people asking you questions at this point.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much.
Do we have any audience questions?
Lauren.
We do. I'll jump in here and just read it for you guys. An anonymous attendee is asking if the greater part of our bodies is, quote, not us, microbial plenitude, etc., where are we located in the not us who are us?
Teresa's dying to answer that question.
Well,
But doesn't that sound like it's a physics question too? Because the universe also, it's mostly this invisible material that we don't even know what it is, that we can't account for yet. But Teresa, what would you say?
I mean, it speaks to me, I'm not sure I have an answer for it, but it speaks to me of one of the tensions that I was going to ask you about in your book around you have, the shadows of humans and trees merging more than once in the book, including to end it. And I think that tension kind of begs that same question of where are we if we're part of the fabric and we are just, as you put it, the one among others, if we're not distinct and we're not separate from the ecosystem. And trees are part of us as part of that system, but we aren't actually trees, and we are, somehow imbued with this consciousness that maybe trees have, or maybe they don't, that we're not connected to, like where those barriers lie. And I think that's a moving target would be my answer. I mean, I think consciousness and awareness and that line between the air and the underwater, right on that line is a place that we're constantly renegotiating, or I am anyway, but I'm not sure how you approached it in writing the book.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful question. And it reminds me of Keats's, negative capability as well, that maybe we don't need to figure it out, but our attentiveness to what's going on is the important thing. Our being attentive to what we are connected to is everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I got so much of like contemplative traditions in your book through that idea of, you have a precision to taxonomy, but not for the sake of pinning things down, of just, no, this is exactly what was there in this moment. And the next moment is already here, but, we're experiencing in this connection of moments. So.
I'm going to jump back in and ask you kind of to go back to this question of personification. And I think when you're speaking about poetry and the ecological, I think a lot, it's not only personification, anthropomorphization, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Yeah,
like actually giving non-living or certainly non-human entities things like will or concrete remorse. Yeah, I'd like you to go back to that because I think it's an interesting question, Forrest. Yeah.
So in Theresa's work, the landscape is constantly taking on agency. The stones envy my stillness, the branches sang me silent. That line that she read earlier, blooms will themselves not to, bulbs will themselves not to bloom. I have a response, but because I already have mine figured out, I'm more interested in Theresa's. Do you want to comment, or do you want me to?
I'd love to hear what you have to say, and then maybe I'll riff after that.
Okay, so I think the ways we used to think about anthropomorphism and personification were ways of finding in the non-human ourselves constantly, sort of always finding a mirror to reflect ourselves, and then we became really afraid of anthropomorphism, almost too afraid of anthropomorphism, so that we became afraid of making any connections between human experience and the experience of other animals, which is why Descartes could dissect living dogs, which were screaming and struggling on the operating table, and explain to people that they weren't really actually having feelings, because to assume they were having feelings would be anthropomorphism. So there's a re-encountering of our relationship with the non-human now that I think is also connected to eco-poetics, which I think is a broad thing that isn't even a thing, but maybe a trajectory in poetics now that I would include Theresa's work as part of, that is interested not in finding the mirror, but in finding the ways that that we are made up of otherness as well, and that if we cut ourselves off from that, that it's precisely what leads us to turn the rest of the world into just instrumental objects for our own use.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that that's partly how we've gotten to this point ecologically, is just that sense of disconnection and that lack of empathy. And I think I spent a lot of my life feeling like I felt too much. And speaking of dissecting dogs, we were forced to dissect a chicken wing in 7th grade, and I never ate meat again because I just, seeing the veins, I was like, I can't. And I, to this day, have not eaten meat. And I have come to find, at least as far as the witnessing and the creation of art and the being in contact with the present moment, that you can't actually feel too much. If you're willing to ride that wave, you can't actually feel too much. And I know you've said in interviews, people have said, will eco-poetics fix climate change? And you said no. Yeah. And I would agree, no. And yet there's something about that process of inviting people into that moment-to-moment witnessing that could be some kernel of healing. So yeah.
That's a great way to end it, on the kernel of healing. Lovely, Theresa.
Oh, thank you. It's been such an honor to speak with you. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody watching.
Versa versa, Theresa. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Kate.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, audience, for being here and engaging with this conversation. Thank you. I don't know that I mentioned, we have an event sponsor for this and all of our Montana Book Festival events this year, and that's our fiscal sponsor, Arts Missoula. So thank you to Arts Missoula. Just as a reminder, you can purchase Forrest's Twice Alive and Theresa's Borderline Fortune at Fact and Fiction Books. Be sure to enter MBF when you check out on their website, which we threw the links into the chat there, factandfictionbooks.com. Or if you are in Missoula, Montana, you can go into the store in person and you can vocally say the code NBF. 20% of all festival title sales come back to the festival so that we can continue programming like this into the future. So thank you again, Forrest and Theresa. This was a fascinating conversation. I am honored to host you today, and I thank you for the books as well.
Thanks a lot, Laura.
Yeah. Everyone have a
What a
wonderful
pleasure.
afternoon. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Have a great day.